I feel pretty comfortable introducing our next speaker. One reason is that we've known him for about 13 years now. He has stayed in our home, slept in a small bed in Lou's office. He's stayed, no, he hasn't stayed in our bathroom, but he has seen our bathroom in all of its former pinkness. He's put up with our dogs, which he doesn't like, and has put down brownies and wine, which he does. And his picture, along with our cat, is on our refrigerator. But the main reason for my comfort level is that the worst introduction to Dale Ahlquist has already been given by Jeanne Horvath. This unfortunate and embarrassing situation happened on Ash Wednesday, March 5th, 2014. It was admitted to by Lou, readily agreed by Dale. It was the worst, right? And being the worst can't be worsted. And who remembers the silver and bronze medalist anyway? I think I'm safe. Have you ever noticed that there's something different about Dale? St. Paul assures us in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, that we're all blessed with gifts, and then he lists them. I studied the list to see if I could identify Dale's gift. Was it perhaps the gift of healing? No. The working of miracles? I don't think so. Prophecy? No. The interpretation of tongues? You know a little Italian? I don't think that's it. The gist of it is, Dale wasn't there. We'll call it the gift of something else. It lies somewhere between the gift of hospitality, bilocation, and the manipulation of time. Let me describe this. Every year after the conference, so many people come up to us and say, "That Dale is such a great guy. He talked with me over a glass of wine for at least an hour." If we add it up, 10 conferences, a few get-togethers, so many people, so many glasses of wine. If we add up the time he's supposed to have been talking to people, this would have required standing in our living room, talking and drinking nonstop for 5 years, 3 months, and 14 days. We lost count of the number of glasses of wine. I don't understand it. Maybe we don't really know this man. But he shows up every year, enlightens us on Chesterton, and makes us laugh. Please welcome Dale.
I want to start by us all just acknowledging Lou and Jeanne for running this conference for 11 years. By the way, Jeanne, that was the best introduction. Lou, as you heard earlier, he said that I was asked to speak on the outline of Sanctity, but he said that I would probably talk about whatever I wanted. I misunderstood that. I am going to talk on the outline of Sanctity. I thought what he said was I could talk as long as I wanted. So this will be a very short talk, hopefully. But yeah, the outline of Sanctity. What are the basic requirements for being a saint? We have this amazing thing that has been put before us that was unthinkable a few years ago, that Chesterton's cause may actually be opened pretty soon. I stood here last year and told you how the Bishop of Northampton was going to appoint a investigator, and he did, an investigator to Chesterton's potential cause. And we had the great privilege of having Father Udris come and speak to our conference. And I've talked with him privately too, and he is absolutely enthusiastic that his report will be positive and that the Bishop of Northampton will approve his report and will put it forward that the cause should be open. He says the one hurdle is going to be the bishops of England have to sort of get together and agree that the cause should go forward to Rome before Rome would approve opening the cause. And he said the problem is not that anyone's going to be against it. In fact, there'll be several bishops who will be for it. The problem will be there'll be some bishops who don't want to do anything because they don't like to do things, because that requires that they have to do something, and they just really want to get through the rest of their life until a different bishop takes over. And so there's going to be some lobbying that needs to be done, and that'll be fun. So that's where the status is right now. I would say he's probably less than 6 or 7 months away from making his final report. When he came to the conference, and at the end of the conference, I said to him, I bet you've never seen a cult like this one around a saint. And he said, yeah, there's nothing quite like it. And we are, keep this in your prayers, we're seriously going to be moving forward with the idea of creating an actual lay apostolate around G.K. Chesterton. And that will probably be the entity that is that puts the cause forward officially. What's the word? There's a word I'm looking for, Father. Who officially introduces the cause?
Posture.
That's the posture.
Sometimes people call it
Petitioner. The word I'm looking for is petitioner. Yeah, you're all thinking of. I asked something else. Yeah, no, petitioner. Our apostle would be the actual petitioner in the cause. So, and you might all be part of that apostolate. So, get your checkbooks out. All right. It's interesting. I've talked about what is the outline of sanctity. Our previous speakers very cleverly did give us the outline already of sanctity. Father Wilde talked about Chesterton's mysticism, which indicates this very close and intimate relationship with God that helps us understand God better. Chesterton says the mystic is someone who passes through the moment when there is nothing but God. He's describing St. Francis, but as Father and I certainly agree, he seems to be describing himself as well. The mystic does not mystify, does not make things obscure, he makes things clear. Chesterton does that. He doesn't hide things, he reveals them. And like he shares that mystical understanding with St. Francis, Chesterton also defined mysticism as simply an elevated form of common sense. And if you read Father Wilde's other book, the one on jousting with the devil, he fulfills that other basic requirement for a saint, which is that real understanding of evil, that he also had to wrestle with the devil. And with that, of course, he shares an affinity with St. George, the patron saint of England, but also St. Michael, the archangel. And he understood evil, but he doesn't dwell on evil. He dwells on good. Because he dwells on good, which is the absence of evil. And that emphasis on the good is what draws people to Chesterton. It's his own goodness. And of course, Father Caton just beautifully described Chesterton as a defender of the faith, which also is the image of the warrior who defends what is attacked. But his sword is his pen. And he combines faith and reason with the spirit of St. Thomas Aquinas. And then, of course, Joseph Pierce did a marvelous and creative job of talking about humility and thankfulness, the really two essential qualities, two essential virtues of being a saint. And there's no question that humility is Chesterton's greatest virtue. And as Joseph rightly pointed out, pride being the worst of the deadly sins, the corollary to that is that humility is possibly the greatest of the virtues. It's certainly the most necessary of the virtues before any of the others are possible. And of course, Chesterton's humility is evident in everything he writes. It's also evident in all the stories about him. Right after he moved to Beaconsfield, he said to a fellow resident, "When I sit by the wayside, the villagers look, and they take me for one of two things. They either take me for the village idiot, or for one of Herod's delivery vans." And it was because he was good that he was not afraid of the truth, and not afraid to speak the truth, but it's because he was humble that he was able to speak the truth in love. And in fact, he was so humble he didn't even feel worthy of the truth that he loved so much. Sanctity requires virtue, but it requires heroic virtue, as we always hear about the saints. Did he have heroic virtue? And we live in a time when displaying any virtue seems heroic. But virtue is actually the norm. It's what's supposed to. It's what we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be virtuous. That's what we were created to be. And vice is abnormal, and it goes against natural law. And while all of the virtues are connected and reinforce each other, our problem is that we have the tendency to separate them. In fact, there's that line of Chesterton's from Orthodoxy in that penny book that you just bought. And I quote this line every day. It comes up every day. It's about to come up right now. Chesterton says that in a broken society, two things happen. The vices run wild and they do great damage. But the other problem is that the virtues run wild. And the virtues do even more damage because they become isolated from each other and wander alone, and then they actually start doing war with each other. So that you have some people who care only about truth, and some people who care only about pity. But the people who care only about truth, their truth is pitiless, and the people who care only about pity, their pity is untruthful. Perfect example of the two ends of the spectrum that are doing constant war with each other today. And yet, as Chesterton maintained, that cultivating even one virtue is still a step towards God, because he had a conversation with a Catholic woman at a college here in New York when he visited in 1930. In a conversation with him, she talked about, she was teaching Dante, and she said how hard it was to explain to Protestant students the degrees in heaven and hell and how the will shapes them. And Chesterton responded, yes, and even more difficult to explain is how one sin can make a hell and one act of virtue make the beginning of heaven in the soul. So the 7 virtues are composed of the 4 cardinal virtues: prudence, temperance, justice, and courage, and then the 3 theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Prudence is probably the hardest of the virtues to explain, even to understand. People sometimes equate prudence with simply worrying and thinking about how all the things that could possibly go wrong. Kind of a Murphy's Law view of the world. In fact, Chesterton responds and he says, it's obvious that all marriages are imprudent marriages. Just as all births are imprudent births. If prudence is your main concern, or if, in other words, you are a coward, it's certainly better not to get married and even not to be born. But what prudence is, it's good judgment. And Chesterton says the things that go with good judgment are a sense of humor, charity, and the dumb certainties of existence. And the best understanding of prudence comes from Robinson Crusoe. It is, says Chesterton, the poetry of limits. Nay, even the wild romance of prudence. Crusoe's a man on a small rock with a few comforts just snatched from the sea. The best thing in the book is simply the list of things that he saved from the wreck. Every kitchen tool becomes an ideal because Crusoe might have dropped it into the sea. It's a good exercise in empty or ugly hours of the day to look at everything. The coal scuttle, the bookcase, and to think of how happy one could be to have brought it out of the sinking ship and onto the solitary island. But it's a better exercise still to remember how all things have had this hairbreadth escape. Everything has been saved from a wreck. Every man has had one horrible adventure. As a hidden, untimely birth he had not been, as infants that have never seen the light. Men spoke much in my boyhood of a restricted or ruined man of genius, and it was common to hear it said that he was a great might have been. Well, to me, it's a more solid and startling fact that any man in the street is a great might not have been. So that's why prudence has to be balanced by courage. And Chesterton, of course, says of courage that Christianity alone of all the creeds added courage to the virtues of the Creator. This is what happened with the incarnation and the crucifixion. For the only courage worth calling courage must necessarily mean that the soul passes a breaking point and does not break. So he talks about the pagan virtues as opposed to the Christian virtues. Justice means finding out a certain thing due to a certain man and giving it to him. Temperance consists in finding the proper limit of a particular indulgence and adhering to that. But charity means pardoning the unpardonable, or it's no virtue at all. And hope means hoping when things are hopeless, or it's no virtue at all. And faith means believing the incredible, or it's no virtue at all. And these are the things we need to be happy. The only argument, he says, against losing faith is that you lose hope, and generally charity. Now, as you all know, the Catholic Church confuses us by having two sets of 7 virtues. The 7 I just named, the Christian virtues, the cardinal virtues. But there are the 7 heavenly virtues, which came along as proper alternatives to the 7 deadly sins. So you have pride, that is balanced by humility, wrath, patience, envy, kindness, avarice, charity or generosity, lust, chastity, gluttony, temperance, sloth, diligence. Now, in my book, The Complete Thinker, I have a chapter about the 7 deadly sins. I don't write really anything about the 7 heavenly virtues because that would be hard. But I guess the time has come, so I'd like to quickly go through a Chestertonian perspective of the 7 heavenly virtues. We've already talked about humility. We've really gotten a good dose of that. So I'll just skip that. In fact, I'll skip more stuff than Father Scott skipped in his talk. In fact, the next heavenly virtue is patience. I could make you wait for that one, but we can't even talk about patience without mentioning Job. You know, it's always the patience of Job. Job, Chesterton's favorite book of the Bible. It's so interesting because it's about the riddle of suffering, and patience is what you need to get through suffering. And suffering is such an intimate part of the faith. And Chesterton makes this great point in his essay on the book of Job that God sends suffering not to the people who deserve it, but the people who don't deserve it. It's not the bad people that get this, it's the good people. And that's how they hone their patience. He says there's a distinction that has to be made. The essence of a medical cure is that a man is patient. But the essence of a moral cure is that the patient must be impatient, because nothing can be done until he hates his own sin more than he loves his own pleasure. And I'll quote one more great quotation, and it's not by Chesterton. It's by a Ratzinger named Benedict. He says, "The world is ruined by the impatience of man. The world is saved by the patience of God." Now, the next 2 virtues we can take together, because just as envy and greed sort of go together, even though they're not quite the same, so do kindness and generosity. The counteracting virtues go together. Father Caton talked great did a great job talking about the kindness of Chesterton. He had the power of contentment. He didn't want what other people had. He knew how to be thankful for what he had himself, including, he says, the amazing gift of eyes, ears, hands, and the great world around me. How do I even deserve these things? And I get this great day, and tomorrow I get another one. How am I allowed even two? He thought that one of the funnest things for him was to be snowed in. So he just rediscovered the things in his own house, the books in his library, the pictures on his wall. That was his attempt. That was his equivalent of being Robinson Crusoe. He was stranded in his own house. He had no desire to be rich. As Father Brown says, to be clever enough to get all that money, one must be stupid enough to want it. And he was never actually financially secure until his mother died and he got the inheritance of her estate. And that only happened 3 years before his own death. So until that time, he clearly made his living doing the thing he was made to do, which was right. And during that time, he certainly gave away more than his tithe. He paid for the education of nephews and for children of friends, and paid other people's medical bills, and the thing that he did with great consistency is the thing that is so frowned upon. He gave money to beggars. And he never had any money in his pockets at the end of the day because he gave away anything he didn't spend. And he was also generous with his time and his talent, because that's the thing that most of us are least generous with. And his time was so in demand. But he used his great literary gifts to write literary contributions to charitable books that were printed all the time, such as the Blinded Soldiers and Sailors Gift Book, the Belgian Relief Effort, Aid for the Relief Fund of Russian Refugees, Aid for the Royal Victorian Hospital for Consumption, and even for the Titanic Disaster Relief Fund. And then, of course, he supported his own newspaper through his writing of Father Brown stories. Many people had to die to keep that paper alive. And then, of course, the next great heavenly virtue, chastity or purity, as opposed to lust. His very famous quintessential essay that every Chestertonian and everybody else has to read is A Piece of Chalk, where he talks about white being a color, not the absence of color, something positive, not negative, just as chastity or purity is not simply the absence of vice, but something flaming like Joan of Arc. And he says white is indeed is almost a definition of paradise, since it means purity, but it also means freedom. The human race has always admired the Catholic virtues, however little it can practice them. And oddly enough, it has most admired them that the modern world most sharply disputes. Chesterton says we all disapprove of prostitution, yet we don't all quite approve of purity. And there's that form of chastity, of course, that's associated with the religious life, which is the cult of the Virgin and the cult of virginity, but the laity, which is the great majority of the church to which Chesterton belonged, chastity is connected to sex. In fact, it's the only proper context for sex. Chesterton says, mankind declares with one deafening voice that sex may be ecstatic so long as it is restricted. It's not necessary that the restriction should even be reasonable. It's just necessary that it should restrict. And that's the beginning of all purity. He says purity is the only atmosphere for passion. And he says, I believe in monogamy as the one complete adventure of man. And I think this is one of his most, this is just an amazing line in today's culture. It's in his book on Shaw. He says, the reward of chastity is a clearness of intellect. Now let's talk about the tough one. See, I got through the lust one without any problem. Temperance as opposed to gluttony. Now the first thing to point out about temperance is that it's not abstinence. Chesterton had to keep pointing this out to a culture that had been very twisted by Puritanism. which is that attack on God's good pleasures that made not only smoking and drinking evil, but almost anything that appeals to the senses as evil. Like beauty. There was an attack on beauty. That was the beginning of the ugliness that came into architecture, particularly church architecture. Puritanism was epitomized by Prohibition, which almost came to England and did, of course, come to America. And we are actually still living with the results of that twisted view of material joy. Because he says the reaction to Puritanism is always an overreaction and becomes hedonism. And he says, he points out that the Prohibition was brought about by organizations that called themselves temperance leagues. But temperance leagues did not promote temperance. They promoted abstinence on the philosophy that drinking was a sin. And they condemned wine in the name of the one who turned water into wine. And he says, actually, that all of these, it was also non-Christian movements that came along with it that started to promote these back-to-nature philosophies and the promotion of the simple life. Chesterton says, if you go back far enough, what do you get to? He says, I believe that the fall of man was due to the introduction of the simple life. In a state of innocence, our first ancestors ate beef and drank beer like Christians. Then came the tempter, the spirit of intellectual pride and intellectual perversity. He took the form of a serpent, because that form is full of evil simplicity. And he said with the elaborate lucidity of modern hygiene, all these meals are unnecessary to health. Take one raw apple, madam. In the early morning, another at noon. The apple, best suited for our purposes, of a particular chemical quality at once nutritious and light. It grows on a tree, which I will show you in a minute. Now, temperance means restraint. Doesn't mean abstinence. We show our strength when we restrain our strength. Restraint is the greatest show of strength. Freedom is essential to Chesterton's philosophy. Freedom means being able to rule ourselves. It's self-government, self-control, which is also the basis of democracy. Freedom doesn't mean doing whatever you want. It means controlling what you do of your own free will, rather than having it controlled for you by something else. It's an act of the will. And the glutton, of course, is ruled by his appetite and doesn't have self-control. So the question is, well, Chesterton, he was fat. Was he a glutton? The answer? No. Ha! According to his lifelong friend, Edmund Clearhugh Bentley, Chesterton's great weight was due to a glandular condition, and his secretary, Dorothy Collins, also said she was amazed by how little he ate. It seemed like he had to be prompted to eat. And, we point these things out, but we will not deny the fact that Chesterton was fat. We will hasten to add that he was not as fat as St. Thomas Aquinas. He certainly drank, he defended drinking, but he never defended drunkenness. And there are no accounts really of him getting drunk. And he said that no animal ever invented anything so bad as drunkenness or so good as drink. But his great line, drink because you are happy, and never because you are miserable. And never drink when you are wretched without it, or you will be like the gray-faced gin drinker in the slum. But drink when you would be happy without it, and you will be like the laughing peasant of Italy. Never drink because you need it, for that is rational drinking, the way to death and hell. But drink because you do not need it, for this is irrational drinking and the ancient health of the world. Now, though temperance and abstinence are different from each other, of course they are connected because they both involve self-control and self-sacrifice. And sacrifice is only possible with humility because it means giving up something that you enjoy as a gift. It's a sacrifice. You're giving it up not because it's bad, you're giving it up because it's good. That's what the purpose of a gift is, and of a sacrifice. And Chesterton defines sacrifice as the idea of not taking our advantage to the full. And his own sacrifice and self-control, humility, and example of not taking advantage to the full is really in the way that he debated and argued with people, because he could have taken his advantage to the full and really truly annihilated his intellectual opponents. But he always showed his restraint, and he treated everyone with this respect, and he sometimes lamented the fact that he couldn't use the same tools that they use, because he did have all the advantage, because he had the truth on his side. But he knew that his opponent was not an enemy, but a friend. And he always wanted to treat them as a friend and get them over to his side, because that's the purpose of winning the argument. And this, he says, but it's this lack of self-control, of unrestrained indulgence, that is not only present in other vices, it can even be present in the virtues, and can turn the virtues into vices. He says, righteous indignation can be carried too far. Sometimes charity can be carried too far because we use it as an indulgence rather than something that we're paying for. He says, a man should at last pay for his charity with his money, and a man should at last pay for his anger with his blood. At least there should be a reasonable risk that he will have to give if he is compassionate and fight if he is angry. And then the final virtue on our list is diligence, which is to counter the sin of sloth. And sloth is the sin that Chesterton said he was most guilty of. But let the record show, he wrote and wrote and wrote. He was nothing if not diligent. He wrote until he was dead. Until his final collapse in the few days that he was in a semi-coma until he died, he was writing up until the day he couldn't lift up the pen anymore. And he actually longed for leisure. The amount that he wrote, everyone, is still unknown. We are still finding things he wrote. In the last few months, we found almost 100 previously unknown essays of Chesterton. It's just astonishing how much he wrote. And the British Library, when they came to collect his papers, said there's more here than one person could have written. It's just not possible to say he was guilty of sloth. And the fact is, he longed for leisure. He longed for leisure. He says, leisure is a word that means three totally different things. It means, one, being allowed to do something, two, being allowed to do anything, and three, being allowed to do nothing. And he says, I never have enough nothing to do. The sin of sloth is that we become passive. And there's a danger in becoming passive, because it means letting someone else do the work. And he says, people who cannot amuse themselves but are only amused, people who must be kept working, that means that other people must be kept working to amuse them. And when we are amused by machinery, well, men must work machines, which is not amusing. And though the toiling by the sweat of our brow is certainly a curse, honest work is something creative that we do to really show our own creativity, because we are made in the image of God, the Creator. And he says, I believe in making thousands of things, making jokes, making pictures, making goods, making books, making toys, making tools, making farms, making homes, making churches, making sacred images. But what is the one work that most of us avoid? He says there is one kind of work which any man can do, but from which many men shrink, generally because it's very hard work. Sometimes they fear it will lead them where they do not wish to go. It is called thinking. And Chesterton did that hard work better than anyone else. We see that he had these virtues, no matter which list of 7 virtues you want to use. But the point is, so should we. Sanctity is for everybody. Sainthood is for everybody. Chesterton says any man can be a saint if he chooses. But part of being a saint is being virtuous. Very, very virtuous. And there's no alternative. He says, unless we strive every instant to be monsters of virtue, we have the danger of becoming monsters of vice. In fact, we are living in an age, he says, when we need the virtues just to remain sane. Let's see here. I want to know how much of this talk I should skip here. All right. Some good stuff here. Boy, you're not going to hear this either. It's great. Blessedness. In order to become a saint, you have to become blessed. What are the Beatitudes? We know them. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. The merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, and those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness. Chesterton epitomizes these Beatitudes. We see it in his humility, his mourning, his kindness, his thirst for justice, his charity towards his enemies, his basic goodness that drew people to him, his patience with those who attacked him. And the thing is, he also gave his own flavor to the Beatitudes. You know, the Beatitudes themselves are so paradoxical that they epitomize Chesterton, because Chesterton is the master of paradox. And what could be more paradoxical than saying, blessed are the poor. Blessed are those who mourn. This completely goes against our expectations. They're so paradoxical. But Chesterton says there's other Beatitudes, like blessed are those who have seen and not yet believed, he says, is a passage which is really a prophecy of modern journalism. He says, blessed are the poor, for they alone have not the poor always with them, but the honest poor can forget poverty, but the honest rich can never forget it. And he says grief is a thing that really is popular. If we consider it, everyone will know how impressive it is, and we've understood it, then we might understand the great voice that said, blessed are the poor, and then said, blessed are those that mourn. And in the book of Revelation, where it says, I heard a voice from heaven cry, blessed are the dead. Chesterton says, I don't know what that meant, but I think I know that the person who said it knew what it meant. And then the man who said, blessed is he that expects nothing, for he shall not be disappointed, is a eulogy that is inadequately and even false. The truth is, blessed is he that expects nothing, for he shall be gloriously surprised. The man who expects nothing sees redder roses than common men can see, greener grass, and a more startling sun. Blessed is he that expects nothing, for he shall possess cities and mountains. Blessed is the meek, for he shall inherit the earth. And until we realize the things that might not be, we cannot realize the things that are. So, if the world wrote the Beatitudes, the world's Beatitudes would be completely the opposite from Christ's. They'd be more along the lines of, blessed are the rich, for theirs is the kingdom of earth. And blessed are those who have no family or friends, because they will never have to mourn. And blessed are the strong, for they shall conquer the earth. And blessed are those who do not care about justice or righteousness, for they never have to be troubled by their conscience. And blessed are those who show no mercy, for they will have vengeance. And blessed are the pure in lust, for they can do whatever their body tells them. And blessed are the war makers, for they can settle arguments without even arguing. And blessed are those who are unwilling to suffer for what is right, for they will stay comfortable. That is the way of the world. But the man who wrote the iconic line, a dead thing goes with the stream, only a living thing can go against it, who said that the Catholic Church is the only thing that saves a man from the degrading slavery of being a child of his age, he clearly understands what the Catholic Church means by beatitude, about going against the world and having to contradict the world. And that is why he chose the vocation of being a controversialist, because he knew what the cross meant. The cross is the sign of contradiction. And that's why he made the sign of the cross over every room before he entered it, and made the sign of the cross with his match before he lit his cigar. He knew what was represented by the ultimate paradox in the cross, that here is eternity contradicting time, and life contradicting death. G.K. Chesterton contradicts the world. And he said, the world is converted by the saint who contradicts it most. God bless you.